Rachel James had never thought she'd return to the house she grew up in. The modest, two-story property tucked at the far end of Alder Ridge Lane, with its red brick facade and aging wooden fence, had once been a warm haven of childhood memories and loud Sunday dinners. But time, as it always does, changed the texture of those memories. After her parents passed away within months of each other, her mother from a sudden cardiac event and her father from what the doctors had called complications. But what Rachel knew was a slow crumbling of a man after losing his partner of 4 decades. She found herself standing at the cracked front steps with a key in hand and 1,000 logistical and emotional tasks awaiting her. She hadn't expected to feel anything, having built a life of independence elsewhere, but the house didn't care about her expectations. It greeted her with a strange, silent familiarity that made her uneasy from the start. Not because it was haunted or particularly eerie, but because it still felt lived in. Not by spirits or ghosts, but by presence, a kind of residual energy from years of routine and human rhythm that hadn't yet been replaced by Rachel's own patterns. She took her time settling in, not emotionally, but practically. There were bills to reroute, accounts to close, outdated furniture to donate or discard, and repairs to catalog. The house had been well cared for, but age leaves its fingerprints on every surface. The roof needed patching in one corner, the electrical panel was outdated and prone to hiccups, and the plumbing groaned during cold mornings like an old man with sore knees. Rachel, who ran a successful appliance repair and consulting business, wasn't daunted by any of this. In fact, fixing things gave her a sense of control, and control was the only thing that helped her sleep at night. So she approached the task with precision, moving room by room, making notes, drafting budgets, and creating timelines. She liked systems. What she didn't like, however, was disruption, and disruption arrived, quietly and deceptively, in the form of the garage. The garage had always been her father's domain. He had been a quiet man, a methodical one, who used the space for woodworking, car repairs, and minor household projects. Rachel remembered being told as a child not to touch anything in there unless he was present. After he died, she had avoided the garage during her initial sorting of the property, not out of sentimentality, but because she knew it would be a tangle of wires, tools, half-finished projects, and probably some ancient insect nests. It wasn't until her 3rd week in the house, when she needed to retrieve her pressure washer to clean the moss-covered deck, that she unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The air was dry and dusty, filled with the faint scent of engine oil, cedar, and metal. Shelves lined the back wall stacked with labeled containers, toolboxes, and neatly organized bins. The floor was relatively clean, a testament to her father's discipline, and most of the lights still worked, flickering on after a moment's hesitation. At first glance, everything seemed exactly how it should be. Frozen in time, but familiar. But then she noticed a plastic storage bin that didn't belong. It was new, relatively speaking, its surface unscuffed and marked with a large K written in thick black marker across the top. That alone wouldn't have triggered anything. Perhaps her father had added something new before passing. But when she opened the lid, a slow chill crept up her spine. Inside were children's items. Not toys, but things like outdated school uniforms, old sketchbooks, and a faded doll with a missing eye. Underneath them was a vacuum-sealed pouch of documents labeled medical, private, along with an envelope addressed not to anyone in her family but simply to hold until contacted. Rachel blinked, unsettled. She didn't recognize any of it. She knew her parents' handwriting, their storage methods, their logic. This bin wasn't part of it, and something about its contents, the personal nature, the anonymity, made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. She closed the lid, slid it onto the workbench, and sat on the edge of a stool, staring at it for several minutes as a fan hummed somewhere overhead. Her first instinct was to call her older cousin and ask if he knew anything, But as she dialed, she hesitated. She hated the idea of sounding paranoid, so she hung up before the first ring. Instead, she decided to install one of her backup motion-activated cameras on the interior ceiling beam of the garage. It wasn't paranoia. It was standard practice. She told herself this repeatedly, even as she tucked the small black device into a discreet corner, angled to capture the entire entrance and interior without obstructing anything. It would trigger only with movement and save footage directly to the cloud. The next morning, the bin was in a different position, just slightly but enough to notice. The corner wasn't aligned with the shelf edge the way she'd left it. She opened it. Nothing was missing, as far as she could tell, but now a small packet of photographs had been added. Family photos, none of them hers, with dates written in careful cursive. One of them showed a woman standing in front of the very garage she was in now. Only the bushes in the background were taller, and the siding hadn't yet been repainted. The woman looked familiar. Then Rachel realized. It was Karen, the woman from 3 doors down, always with a perfectly trimmed lawn and a rotation of designer sunglasses. They'd only exchanged pleasantries once or twice. Karen had complimented her work boots and made a joke about needing help with her own ancient garbage disposal. But now, seeing her in that photo, smiling in front of Rachel's garage from what looked like a decade ago, something twisted in Rachel's stomach. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't confront Karen. She didn't move the bin again. She simply waited, knowing the camera was watching. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, just after midnight, the motion sensor sent a notification to Rachel's phone. She opened the app and watched, barely breathing, as Karen stepped into the garage from the side door like she belonged there. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She walked directly to the shelf, placed another bin beside the first one, and looked around the garage with a kind of ownership that made Rachel's skin crawl. Then Karen did something even stranger. She reached up and gently adjusted the overhead light pull cord, as though she were resetting a personal habit. Rachel sat in her dark bedroom, staring at the footage, her pulse steady but her breath shallow. There was no doubt now. Karen believed she had some right to this space. But where did that belief come from? No lease, no agreement, no mention of shared use had ever come up in her review of the property documents. Her parents had never spoken of it. It made no sense, and yet the evidence was as clear as daylight. Someone had been using her garage without her knowledge or consent, and now that someone was casually adding to it, as though reclaiming a storage unit after a hiatus. She didn't rush to confrontation. She knew better. Confrontation without strategy was just emotional venting. Rachel had spent years in a field dominated by technical precision and accountability, and she wouldn't throw that away just because someone was trespassing under a delusion. Instead, she called a lawyer she'd worked with briefly 2 years prior, a transactional real estate expert who also handled disputes over encroachments and easements. They scheduled a consultation for later that week. In the meantime, Rachel gathered documentation, title records, inheritance papers, property maps, and continued to monitor the garage silently. From the outside, nothing about Alder Ridge Lane suggested conflict. It was a quiet street with flower beds and birdhouses, solar-powered path lights, and friendly neighborhood dogs. But behind the fences and trimmed hedges, a battle line was slowly being drawn. Not dramatic, not loud, but precise and deliberate. Karen didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know Rachel had already taken steps. And she certainly didn't know that what had once been a passive, unseen arrangement was now about to be dragged into the light, where legality would determine reality, not perception, not habit, and certainly not personal entitlement. And Rachel, watching silently from behind her locked screen, knew one thing for certain. Once you cross the line of ownership, especially in silence, you forfeit the benefit of the doubt. Karen hadn't just used her garage. She had assumed it was hers. And in the world Rachel lived in, that assumption came with consequences. Rachel didn't sleep well after watching Karen on the security footage. It wasn't fear that kept her awake. Not exactly, but a persistent, gnawing discomfort that something deeply out of place had been happening right under her nose for an unknown amount of time. The footage wasn't a one-off moment of weakness or a confused elderly neighbor mistaking one garage for another. Karen had walked into that space like she had done it dozens of times before, with the composure of someone returning to a familiar storage unit she had every reason to believe still belonged to her. That wasn't just alarming, it was invasive. And Rachel, someone who had always valued boundaries as the first and most fundamental form of respect, felt those boundaries collapsing in real time, slowly and quietly, exactly how intrusions like this always began. She didn't delete the video. She downloaded it, time-stamped it, saved it to a private cloud folder, then to an encrypted drive. There was something surgical in the way she prepared it, as if documenting a crime scene, though she didn't know what crime had technically occurred. That ambiguity frustrated her more than she expected. Karen hadn't broken in. Not really. The door hadn't been damaged. The lock wasn't forced. It had opened smoothly, because Rachel had never changed it. She hadn't thought to. Why would she? The side entrance had always been considered secure, but now it was clear. Someone had retained access. Whether by copying a key long ago or by never returning one at all, Karen, or someone connected to her, still had the means to enter without hesitation. 2 days later, while Rachel was working under the hood of a client's generator in her driveway, Karen strolled by, her presence announced by the unmistakable rhythm of her kitten heels clicking confidently along the concrete. She wore a coral blouse, sunglasses perched high on her forehead, and carried a paper bag in one arm, the kind that looked like it held muffins from some overpriced cafe. Rachel kept her eyes on her work, though her hands slowed just slightly. She had no intention of being the one to start this conversation. Karen, however, had no such reservations. "Hi, Rachel," she said brightly, her voice landing with that calculated casualness that women like her perfected over decades of boundary-skimming social maneuvering. "I was just dropping these off for Marilyn, but I figured I'd say hello. I know things must be a little overwhelming, getting the house in order after all this time." Rachel glanced up briefly. "Appreciate it," she said, voice neutral. "The house is coming together." Karen took a small step closer, the heels shifting softly on the pavement. "It really is a lovely space. Your parents always kept it in such great shape. I remember helping your mom out a few years back with some of the attic stuff. You know, clearing boxes, sorting what to toss. She was always such a minimalist. Didn't like clutter." Rachel gave her a polite nod, unsure where this was going, though she suspected Karen was laying the groundwork for something more pointed. She was right. "I'm glad to see you're keeping the garage in good condition, too," Karen continued, feigning casual interest as her eyes wandered toward the structure in question. "That space has always been so useful. Your dad let me store a few boxes in there years ago. Nothing big, just a few things I didn't have room for at the time. Old schoolwork, keepsakes, things like that. I actually stopped by last week to check in on them. Hope you don't mind." Rachel stood upright then, slowly closing the hood of the generator. "You went into my garage." Karen's smile tightened, just slightly. "Well, yes, I mean, like I said, I've had a few boxes in there for quite a while. Your dad never minded. I have a key from back when he asked me to help move some of the heavier items." I figured it was still okay. "It's not," Rachel said plainly, her voice still calm but her posture no longer neutral. "You don't have permission to enter my garage, and I don't recall my father ever mentioning a storage arrangement with you." Karen tilted her head, that practiced expression of mock confusion spreading across her face. "Oh, dear. Maybe it was just a verbal thing. You know how your dad was. He wasn't always great with formalities, but those boxes have been in there for years. I only go in once or twice a year. I've always kept to the corner, never touched anything of yours." "It's not a matter of space," Rachel replied. "It's a matter of ownership. This house, and everything on the property, is mine now. That includes the garage. You don't have a right to it, Karen." The woman's smile faded entirely now. "Rachel, I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here. I'm not trying to start anything. I've just had access to that garage for a long time. If you really want the boxes gone, I can come collect them. But I'd appreciate a little grace." Rachel crossed her arms. "The grace would have been in asking before letting yourself in. You broke trust, not rules of convenience." Karen's face shifted then, not in a dramatic villainous way, but with the subtle collapse of a carefully maintained persona. Her mouth twitched in annoyance and her tone sharpened just a bit. "Well, it seems we see things differently. I'll come get my things soon and we can both move on." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. The moment had passed. Karen turned with a measured pivot and continued on down the sidewalk, her heels now sounding more like a metronome counting down something inevitable. By the following afternoon, Rachel received a letter in the mailbox, not from Karen, but from the neighborhood committee. It was printed on simple white paper, unsigned but stamped with the emblem of the local community advisory board, a largely ceremonial group that still held sway over property aesthetics, disputes, and communal grievances. The letter read as if lifted from a boilerplate form, stating that a concerned neighbor had brought forth a shared-use conflict involving auxiliary storage access that predated the current ownership of Rachel's property. The committee was requesting a meeting to discuss resolution strategies and maintain neighborhood harmony. Rachel read the letter twice. It didn't accuse her of anything directly, but it framed the issue with an insidious neutrality that felt deeply disingenuous. She could see Karen's fingerprints all over it. Not literal ones, but the linguistic ones of a person skilled in appearances and manipulating institutional language to obscure real intent. Karen had gone around her, weaponized implication, and cloaked it in committee language. And now Rachel was being asked to explain why someone else was using her space without permission. But Rachel didn't panic. She didn't storm down the street or post dramatic rebuttals in the community forum. Instead, she scanned the letter, saved a copy, and forwarded it to her lawyer, attaching the footage and a brief summary of the timeline. The reply came within the hour. "Do not respond to them directly. I'll issue a cease and desist letter and request acknowledgement of unauthorized entry. This qualifies as a boundary dispute. Let's keep it documented." Rachel closed her email and sat at the dining table, fingers steepled under her chin. This was no longer about some boxes or a forgotten favor. Karen had escalated, and not by yelling or breaking in, but by reasserting her presence through quiet, polite channels that required Rachel to either comply or appear hostile. That was the trick. Force a person to defend what's already theirs, make them feel like the aggressor for saying no. But Rachel didn't play games she hadn't studied. She had no intention of being reactive. And she knew now that Karen had no clue she'd been caught on camera. No idea her words had been documented. No inkling that Rachel wasn't just standing her ground. She was anchoring it in paper and law. The game had started. Karen had made her move. Rachel was going to answer. And she would do it her way. Strategically, quietly, and with a patience that Karen would never see coming. Rachel had expected pushback from Karen. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed and coordination of it. Within 72 hours of her lawyer submitting the cease and desist notice, she began receiving subtle signs that Karen was not only undeterred but emboldened. The first came in the form of a voicemail left on her office line. A breathy, clipped message from a man who identified himself only as Douglas from the advisory board, speaking in vague but insistent terms about the tone of recent correspondence, and how unfortunate it would be if this minor misunderstanding spiraled into something larger. He didn't mention Karen by name, but his choice of language made it clear whose interests he was defending. Rachel saved the message, forwarded it to her attorney, and said nothing. The second sign was more concrete. She found her recycling bins overturned one morning, the contents scattered strategically across her driveway, not in a haphazard mess like a raccoon would make, but with a curious neatness. Her shredded mail, still in strips, was arrayed across the hood of her car. Nothing valuable was taken, nothing overtly damaged, but the message was clear. Someone had been close, someone had crossed a line, and someone wanted her to feel watched. She cleaned it up in silence, checked the footage, and found a 2-hour window where the camera feed had been corrupted. It hadn't stopped recording. Rather, the footage was rendered unreadable during a small block of time just before dawn. She filed a complaint with the manufacturer, backed up all her remaining video data, and installed a second camera inside the kitchen, facing the backyard gate. Rachel didn't go to the police. Yet. She knew how these things could play out. Vague acts of disruption with no fingerprints, no witnesses, no real damage. The police would take a report, nod sympathetically, and file it away until something more serious happened. Instead, she focused on control, on restoration. She replaced the locks again, this time switching to a digital code system with randomized entries and a remote log of every activation. She reinforced the side window with a sensor-triggered spotlight and bolted the interior storage shelving directly to the studs, making them harder to move or tamper with. It was less about physical security now and more about sending a signal. This space is monitored, reinforced, and claimed. But Karen wasn't done. The next escalation arrived not under cover of darkness but in the form of paperwork. A notice, taped to Rachel's front door with blue painter's tape to avoid leaving residue, bore the letterhead of the advisory committee. It was a formal complaint, alleging that Rachel had unlawfully restricted access to a shared-use structure that had historically served auxiliary neighborhood storage functions. The wording was convoluted, but the accusation boiled down to this. By locking the garage and removing Karen's belongings, Rachel had allegedly violated an informal but long-standing precedent. The document didn't carry legal weight. It wasn't from a court, but it was designed to look official, printed on heavy paper with a watermark and signed by 3 committee members whose names Rachel didn't recognize. One name, however, was missing: Karen's. She was nowhere on the paper. No signature, no mention. Rachel almost laughed. Karen was using other people now, hiding behind titles and signatures like armor. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Rachel's lawyer confirmed as much. "This isn't about legality," he told her over the phone. "It's psychological. They're trying to rattle you, chip away your patience. They want you to be the first to overreact." He recommended a measured response, a notarized rebuttal outlining the absence of any legal agreement, supported by the property deed, and a timeline of incidents dating back to the first unauthorized entry. He also advised against attending any community hearings about the matter unless they were recorded and included third-party observers. Rachel agreed, but something in her voice was colder than usual. Not angry, not shaken, focused. The next few days passed with an eerie kind of quiet. Karen didn't walk past the house anymore. The usual hum of neighborly chatter around Rachel's driveway had stilled. Even deliveries began arriving with less frequency. Packages dropped hurriedly, drivers lingering only long enough to snap a photo. Rachel didn't imagine it. She felt the shift. It wasn't overt isolation, but a social cooling. The kind that happens when people choose not to pick sides publicly but decide privately which direction the wind is blowing. And then came the second intrusion. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 9. Rachel was cleaning up after dinner when her phone pinged with a motion alert from the garage camera. She opened the app immediately and watched as 2 figures stepped into the frame. One was unmistakably Karen. Her posture, her walk, even the way she held her purse like it was a prop in a performance. The other was a man Rachel didn't recognize. He was tall, wiry, wearing a zippered jacket and gloves despite the warm weather. He carried a clipboard and a measuring wheel. Karen pointed at different corners of the garage, speaking animatedly, while the man jotted notes and ran the wheel along the concrete slab. Rachel stared at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just trespassing. They were surveying. She called the police. This time, she didn't hesitate. The officer arrived 20 minutes later, by which point the garage was empty. Rachel showed him the footage. He watched silently, then said, "They didn't damage anything, so it's a trespass at best. You can press charges, but it's going to hinge on whether they claim they had reason to believe they had access." Rachel knew what that meant. More paperwork, more delays, more ambiguity. She nodded anyway and filed the report. The officer promised to follow up. He wouldn't. Rachel already knew. That night she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from rage. It was the kind of anger that didn't burn hot but slow. An ember lodged behind the ribs, glowing brighter each time someone pretended this wasn't real, wasn't happening, wasn't worth action. She walked the perimeter of the house just before sunrise, checking locks, testing lights, counting security indicators. Everything was as it should be, and yet nothing was. The next day, her lawyer filed a formal request for a temporary restraining order against Karen, citing repeated unauthorized entry and coordinated intimidation. It would take time to process, but the act of filing it gave Rachel a flicker of leverage, something tangible to wield in this war of implications. Karen responded not with a counterclaim, but with silence. A tactical retreat. But silence, Rachel had learned, was not peace. It was positioning. And Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. That Friday, Rachel came home to find a city notice tucked into her mailbox. An anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that the garage was improperly converted to storage use without appropriate permits. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but it meant one thing. A city inspector was coming, and she'd have to justify the use of her own structure on her own land. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't cry. She documented every box, every fixture, every inch of the garage. She gathered receipts, pulled property surveys, and requested written statements from the contractor who had confirmed the garage's structural compliance after her parents' passing. She turned the assault into a checklist. Because if Karen thought she could bury her in paper, she hadn't met the wrong woman. She'd met the right one. And deep down, Rachel knew that Karen hadn't just tried to reclaim space. She'd tried to test something else entirely. Rachel's threshold for pressure. But Karen didn't know that Rachel didn't bend. She builds. Rachel sat across from her attorney, arms crossed, fingers drumming against her elbow as she read over the affidavit he had prepared. The temporary restraining order against Karen had been delayed, not denied. An important distinction, but one that offered little comfort when her home was still subject to these invasive games. The city inspection had gone as well as it could have under the circumstances. The inspector, a lean man with a clipped voice and tired eyes, had shown up on time, checked the garage for any signs of illegal construction, and made clear in the final line of his report that there was no violation. Still, the complaint had done its job. Rachel had lost nearly 2 full days from her client's schedule, spent hours assembling proof for something that had never been in question, and endured another quiet humiliation. Having a stranger walk through her property, clipboard in hand, treating her like a suspect in her own space. She had smiled, nodded, played the part of cooperative homeowner, but inside, she'd been boiling. What truly snapped her patience, though, wasn't the inspection or the paper trail. It was the call that came the morning after. A woman from a local storage company phoned Rachel to confirm an appointment to relocate household boxes from temporary holding at 73 Alder Ridge to private climate-controlled storage, per the ongoing agreement. Rachel asked the woman to repeat herself, and she did, verbatim. There was no hesitation, no confusion on the woman's part. The order had come in under a name she didn't recognize, but with Rachel's address and garage clearly listed. The woman apologized when Rachel told her she had no knowledge of such a request. She promised to cancel the transfer and mark the job as disputed, but Rachel hung up with the unmistakable chill of something bigger happening, something coordinated, quiet, and dangerously methodical. It wasn't just Karen anymore. Rachel felt it in her bones. Karen may have started this with her soft smiles and curated innocence, but someone else had picked up the thread and begun pulling it with far more precision. Rachel didn't say this aloud, not yet, but she mentioned it to her attorney, who nodded slowly and said, "Let me make a few calls." It wasn't comfort, it was alertness, and it confirmed what Rachel had begun to suspect. Karen might be the face, but she wasn't the only hand in this. Rachel didn't wait. She printed out her own copies of the canceled transfer, highlighted every detail, and began mapping a timeline on her wall: dates of intrusion, complaints, calls, documents, visits. Her kitchen began to look like a planning room, not because she was paranoid, but because she was preparing. She refused to be caught flat-footed again. She also submitted a direct request to the advisory board, a formal challenge to the legitimacy of any claims referencing shared use of her property. It was an aggressive move, especially since the board had been trying to mediate behind closed doors, but Rachel was done with euphemisms. She forced their hand, demanded clarity, and set a hard boundary. If they wanted to act as an authority, they'd be treated as one, and that meant public transparency, recorded documentation, and legal accountability. What happened next both shocked and validated her. 2 days later, Rachel received an email, not from the board, not from Karen, but from a former board member, recently retired, who had quietly watched the developments unfold. The subject line was one word: caution. The body of the message was short, carefully worded, and unsigned. It said, "There are archived correspondences where Karen refers to the garage as pre-cleared overflow space and uses board member names without their direct knowledge. Be cautious. This goes deeper than you think." Rachel read the email 5 times. The phrase, "without their direct knowledge," echoed like a siren. It confirmed what she had feared, that Karen had invoked the authority of others to legitimize her claims, using the veneer of community structure to cloak personal entitlement. The archive the message referred to was presumably the board's internal correspondence logs, and Rachel had no access to them, not directly, but she could request them, and she did. Through her attorney, she submitted a formal request for any and all board documentation that referenced her property, its structures, or any past agreements pertaining to storage use or shared access. The board delayed, then denied, then changed their wording to say they could not confirm such documents existed. That was not the same as saying they didn't. While the legal strategy was moving forward, Rachel doubled down on monitoring. She upgraded her cameras to include audio and night vision, rerouted backups to 3 separate sources, and began logging every vehicle that passed slowly in front of her house, some of which she now noticed were doing so far too frequently. She also noticed something subtler: Karen's silence. She had vanished from her usual haunts. No more walks past the mailbox. No more garden maintenance. Her house remained lit in the evenings, curtains drawn, but the performative presence was gone. Rachel suspected why. Late one evening, while reviewing footage from the garage camera, Rachel paused. At 2:03 a.m., a shadow moved across the back corner of the garage, near the vent that led to the crawlspace under the foundation. Someone had been there, briefly, just long enough to place something small and indistinct beneath the storage shelving before retreating out of frame. The camera had captured it, but barely. The motion was calculated, the visibility low. Rachel stared at the frame, heart slow and heavy, and the next morning she called in a private security consultant. Not police, Not friends, not a favor. She paid a professional to walk the perimeter, scan the property, check for anything that didn't belong. They found a passive listening device, cheap, short-range, and battery-operated, wedged behind a shelf bracket in the garage. Rachel didn't react outwardly when the consultant held it up with gloved fingers, but inside, something shifted. A listening device meant someone wasn't just watching her. They were harvesting. Listening for language, context, plans. It was crude, low-tech, but it wasn't a prank. Someone had wanted access to her thinking, to her intentions. Not just her space, not just her garage. Karen had no idea what Rachel had already uncovered. She had no idea Rachel was escalating this behind the scenes, compiling every fragment into a single, undeniable picture. The garage was no longer the battleground. It was the symbol, the test. The way Karen had sought to assert invisible ownership, cloak intrusion in familiarity, make the invasion seem like kindness. It was a strategy Rachel now saw clearly. Pressure without confrontation. Theft without noise. Control without consent. But that strategy had a weakness. It depended on compliance, on silence, on Rachel doing nothing. And Rachel was done doing nothing. Rachel had begun to think there was a rhythm to Karen's invasions, a choreography hidden under the noise, a pattern of appearance, retreat, reaction, and pressure. But the second wave didn't come like the first. It didn't start with a door opening in the night or a pair of footsteps recorded in pixelated silence. It came with the clang of institutional machinery, impersonal and unrelenting, wrapped in formal tone and bureaucratic language that looked harmless until it hit the ground and cracked the foundation beneath it. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the day's delivery. A glossy catalog, a utility bill, a yellow envelope stamped with official city lettering. Rachel opened it on autopilot, standing at the kitchen counter, coffee half full in her hand. Her eyes skimmed the header, Department of Civic Code Enforcement, before they landed on the real problem, a formal notice of compliance review triggered by multiple anonymous reports alleging structural safety violations and improper zoning use on her property. The phrasing was precise, weaponized in its neutrality. It didn't accuse her directly, but it implied risk, non-compliance, liability, all without offering evidence. The notice wasn't a verdict. It was a threat, a scheduled inspection, an invitation to justify herself. And in the fine print, a clause about provisional hearings should the inspector find grounds for further inquiry. Rachel didn't slam the paper down. She didn't swear. She read it twice, underlined the phrase, alleging unpermitted retrofitting, and then called her lawyer with a tone so calm it felt unreal. He answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said, even before she spoke. "Zoning?" "Yes," she replied, "and construction safety. They think I added something to the garage." He sighed heavily. "They're trying to collapse your credibility through the code book. Delay you, shake your footing. It's the long game. The garage is just the lever." "I want a full audit of my permit history," Rachel said, "and I want a property compliance expert on site for the inspection." "I'm not giving them a single opening." He agreed and said he'd have someone by Monday. The inspection was scheduled for Tuesday. Rachel had 72 hours to make her property bulletproof. Again. She spent the weekend not just preparing, but proving. She gathered every permit her parents had filed back through the earliest digital records. She went through receipts, appliance serials, load-bearing certifications from a roofing job 12 years ago. Nothing had been added, not structurally, not since her ownership began. The garage was still what it had always been, a standalone utility space built with municipal approval in the 1980s and untouched since. But she wasn't just preparing a defense. She was learning. The attacks weren't random. They were escalating in a direction. Rachel started mapping Karen's strategy not by reaction, but by projection. What would be the next step, the next angle of approach? What hadn't Karen tried yet? She found the answer the day before the inspection. A knock came at the door just after noon. Not forceful, not casual. Measured. She opened it and found a man in a charcoal suit, early 50s, carrying a slim leather binder. "Miss James," he asked. "I'm Mark Sutherland from the Neighborhood Advisory Legal Counsel. I'd like to request a conversation regarding the ongoing dispute between yourself and a previous community liaison, specifically regarding the auxiliary garage unit." Rachel stared at him. "The garage is not a unit. It's a part of my property. Who sent you?" He offered a tight, practiced smile. "I represent a collective concern, no individual names. I'm here in good faith, not to litigate, but to propose options for de-escalation. There's concern about prolonged legal processes and their impact on community cohesion. No one wants this to become a spectacle." Rachel almost laughed. "You're asking me to let someone continue accessing my building because it makes people more comfortable?" "I'm asking," he said, "whether you'd consider a settlement. Compensation for the space, backdated rent, and formal storage rights for the next year, in exchange for dropping the property surveillance and legal claims. You would retain full title and usage outside agreed parameters. Think of it as formalizing what's already functionally in place." "Functionally?" she repeated. "There is no function. There's trespassing. There's surveillance. There's planting devices. There's obstruction and impersonation. Nothing is in place here." He shifted just slightly. "There are always options. This is one." Rachel leaned on the door frame. "Tell whoever sent you that the next time they want to make an offer, they can do it through discovery." He gave a small nod, not offended. "Then I'll consider this declined." "Consider it revoked," she said, and closed the door. The calm in her voice surprised even her. It wasn't numbness. It was precision, the steadiness of a mind that no longer entertained debate where facts had been replaced with manipulation. The inspection went forward. The city official, this time a younger woman with a rigid clipboard and wary eyes, walked the property for nearly 2 hours. Rachel answered every question without pause, provided documentation before it was requested, and ensured the presence of her compliance consultant, who corroborated every structure as code-conforming. At the end of the session, the inspector paused at the garage door. "There were reports," she said, "about this space being accessed by multiple people over several years. Do you know anything about that?" Rachel looked her in the eye. "Yes, I have documentation of unauthorized entry. The individual in question is currently named in a civil petition." The inspector made a single note. "And you didn't grant any verbal or informal access to others?" "No, nor did the previous owners. I have a sworn statement from the estate attorney on that point." The woman nodded, said nothing more, and left without comment. 3 days later, Rachel received confirmation. No code violations, no zoning infractions, no unresolved permits. Her property was compliant, but Karen's retaliation came that very night. Rachel came home late from a client call to find the fence bordering her backyard had been spray-painted. Not vandalized in the traditional sense, but tagged with careful, almost ceremonial lettering. "Storage, unit in dispute. Property line under. Review." It was written in red paint, evenly spaced as though stenciled. There were no symbols, no profanity, just that message. Rachel took photos, called the police, filed the report. The officer asked if she had enemies. She said only, "One," and she doesn't hide. Cleanup took hours. It wasn't just about removing paint, it was about stripping intent, rejecting false narratives. Rachel repainted the entire side fence the next morning, removed the gate sign, and installed an additional motion-activated spotlight that lit the entire back half of her property. But the message had landed, not just on the wood, but in the minds of her neighbors. The next day, someone left a copy of the community newsletter on her porch, folded open to a column titled "Spaces We Share." It was unsigned. The piece rambled about forgotten arrangements, the importance of maintaining old promises, even when ownership changed. Rachel scanned it once, recognized the cadence of Karen's voice masked in generic prose, and burned it in her kitchen sink. It wasn't about storage. It wasn't even about space. It was about narrative. Who got to write it, and who was forced to live inside someone else's version? Karen had begun crafting her story long before Rachel returned to this house. The bins in the garage, the lies told softly, the invented precedents, the borrowed authority, all of it was a prelude. But now the story had broken open, and Rachel was no longer a background character. She was the problem, the disruption, the one who refused to smile and agree, and that made her dangerous. Rachel didn't flinch. She filed a defamation notice against the advisory board for allowing anonymous articles to circulate referencing her address in public-facing material. Her lawyer sent the board a demand for internal records under civil code protections. And she hired a litigation assistant to prepare discovery notices should the court grant her request to proceed with full action. Because this was no longer about eviction. It was extraction. Rachel wanted Karen out, not just from the garage but from the system she'd corrupted, and she would burn through every paper wall and friendly lie to do it. Rachel had come to understand that silence in this neighborhood was not the absence of conflict but the mask it wore. Everyone saw what was happening, but no one spoke. The glances over trimmed hedges, the sudden quiet when she passed, the vague smiles from neighbors who used to wave more confidently, all of it confirmed that Karen's whisper campaign had landed. Rachel wasn't the victim here. She had been painted as the aggressor, the one refusing to compromise, the one stirring up unnecessary tension. And yet, as her lawyer's file grew thicker and the documents piled into ordered stacks across her kitchen table, Rachel no longer felt pressure to explain herself. She felt clarity. And with that clarity came the willingness to end it, no matter how far she had to go. The culmination began with a phone call. Not from a neighbor, not from a legal office, but from a former client. He sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed as he spoke. He said he had received a casual inquiry from someone named Karen a few days earlier, asking whether he'd ever had concerns about Rachel's professional conduct. She had approached him at a community meeting, not even knowing he was one of Rachel's clients, and started a quiet, calculated line of questions about liability, about reputation. The man wasn't naive. He knew what it was. And he told Rachel not because he was trying to get involved, but because he wanted her to know that someone was trying to damage her outside of property lines. Karen had moved into character assassination. Rachel thanked him, hung up, and without hesitation dialed her attorney. "She's going after my business now," she said plainly. "We move forward." No more response letters. I want a court date. The next step was swift. Her attorney filed a formal civil claim for trespassing, defamation, and interference with business relationships. He attached affidavits from neighbors who had spoken off the record, a full archive of camera footage, police reports, and the report from the private security specialist who had located the listening device in the garage. It was thorough. It was admissible. It was real. Karen, for once, was silent. But the silence didn't last. A week later, just days after court confirmed the complaint had been served, Rachel returned from a hardware supply run to find her garage doors open. Not broken, not pried, open, swinging gently in the breeze. Her heart didn't race. She didn't panic. She parked slowly, walked to the entrance, and stepped inside. The shelving units were intact, her labeled bins untouched, her power tools where they had been left. But the space had been altered. The 2 plastic storage bins Karen had previously planted were now stacked neatly in the center of the garage, each marked in bold ink. Return to owner. Taped to the top bin was a note written in large, impersonal block letters. I no longer require this space. No hard feelings. Rachel stared at the message, then reached for her phone and took a single photo. It wasn't an admission of guilt, not directly, but it was something else, an attempt to rewrite the final chapter before it could be written for her. Karen was staging a retreat, one meant to look dignified, like a mutual resolution, like the act of a rational adult. But it was too late. The line had been crossed long before, and Rachel had no interest in cosmetic apologies. She didn't touch the bins. She called the police, filed another report. She showed them the note. They nodded, took down the details, but again offered no real recourse. It didn't matter. This wasn't about what could be proven in that moment. This was about establishing a sequence. Rachel's lawyer updated the court with the latest incident. It only reinforced her claim. A week before the preliminary hearing, Rachel received another letter. This one not from the city, but from the legal counsel representing the Community Advisory Board. It was dry, evasive, filled with polite disclaimers, but its intent was clear. The board had conducted an internal review and concluded that any previously perceived understandings between community members regarding auxiliary structures were informal and not subject to enforcement. They disavowed any current position in the conflict, removed Karen's name from any future committee appointments, and expressed a vague hope for amicable resolution. Rachel smiled as she read it. It was the bureaucratic version of a white flag. But Karen wasn't finished. Not really. 2 days before the hearing, Rachel received a message from a blocked number. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't desperate. It was, in some ways, worse. It was Karen's voice, calm and polished. Rachel, I'm calling because I don't think any of this has to go further. We've both said things. We've both made moves. But this doesn't help anyone, does it? You've made your point, and I respect your boundaries now. If there's a way to avoid court, I'd like to talk about it. I think we both deserve peace. Rachel saved the voicemail, forwarded it to her attorney, and didn't reply. The hearing proceeded. Karen appeared in court with a sharp black suit and a tightly controlled expression. Her attorney argued that her access had been a long-standing tradition, that Rachel had overreacted, that there was no evidence of criminal intent, only confusion, and that their attempts to mediate had been rebuffed. Rachel's attorney countered with footage, records, messages, timelines. He described the bins, the stenciled fence, the defamation attempts. He referenced the listening device without needing to allege its intent, only its presence. He laid out the portrait of a slow, systematic intrusion framed as tradition. The judge didn't make a ruling that day, but the look on his face was enough. He saw it, not the drama, not the spectacle, the truth. Outside the courtroom, Rachel passed Karen without speaking. The woman didn't look at her. Her shoulders were rigid, her mouth set in that same performative calm. But something in her eyes had changed. Not guilt, not remorse, caution. The kind of caution people adopt only when they finally realize that the person they underestimated is the one holding the pen that will write the final version of events. Rachel didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel anything close to revenge. She felt the fatigue of someone who had protected something sacred, her space, her name, her right to define her own safety. She returned home that evening, walked into the garage, and finally, quietly, moved the 2 bins to the curb. Inside one, beneath a blanket, she found a faded childhood photo that wasn't hers, and a document with names that didn't match anything she recognized. A life half forgotten. A history Karen had tried to bury in someone else's home. But Rachel had not been built to carry other people's ghosts. Not anymore. It rained 2 days after the hearing, one of those slow, persistent summer rains that soaks everything without force, soaking not just the earth but the tension in the air that had clung to the edges of Rachel's property for weeks. The garage stood silent now, its doors sealed, lights rewired, the shelves reorganized and purged of anything not explicitly hers. She had installed a small dehumidifier in the corner, the kind with a digital humidity monitor, and placed a fresh strip of tape along the threshold, half utility, half ritual. It was no longer a contested space. It was hers, unambiguously, and for the first time since her return, the house felt like a single body again, not a structure divided by invisible skirmishes and historical claims whispered behind her back. The neighborhood remained quiet, but not cold. There were no more anonymous newsletters folded on her porch, no glances that lingered too long. People were adjusting, not to her presence, but to her persistence. That was the word that had begun to circulate quietly, according to a neighbor who had finally reached out in solidarity. Not stubborn, not dramatic, persistent. Rachel hadn't yelled. She hadn't chased anyone down or made scenes. She had documented, responded, followed through. It didn't earn her popularity, but it earned her place. The boundary Karen had tried to blur, between ownership and entitlement, between favor and right, was no longer in dispute. The advisory board issued a brief statement at their next community meeting. It wasn't an apology, but it was close. A review of procedural oversight, a call for clearer definitions of common property versus private use, and the formation of a small committee tasked with reviewing such matters going forward with written documentation. Rachel didn't attend the meeting. She didn't need to. The words were cosmetic, but the shift behind them was real. Karen was not reappointed. Her name didn't appear in the minutes, and she no longer walked the neighborhood in her usual loop. Her front lawn, once obsessively manicured, began to fray at the edges. The absence was almost louder than her presence had been. Rachel didn't think about her often, not with bitterness or satisfaction. Karen had played her game with confidence until it became obvious she wasn't playing alone. That was the part that lingered. The realization that others had either enabled her or feared the backlash of confronting her. That was the real danger. Not loud wrongdoing, but quiet accommodation. But that chapter was closed now. Karen had overreached, and when she lost, she did so quietly, with no apology, only withdrawal. Rachel focused on the home. She refinished the garage floor, sealed the windows, replaced the side gate with a reinforced steel frame. Not out of fear, but as a gesture of finality. She didn't expect Karen to return, but she also no longer designed her life around what might happen. She hosted her first evening dinner on the patio 3 weeks later, inviting only a handful of people. Clients turned friends, a neighbor who had slipped her a note of support during the mess, and the cousin who had once warned her to just be careful. No one talked about the case. No one mentioned the bins. They talked about plans, renovations, drought-resistant plants, the usual things people talk about when normalcy is no longer under siege. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, Rachel stood in the driveway and looked toward the garage. The sensor light clicked on. The door was locked. The camera blinked quietly, now angled lower, less aggressive in its posture. It wasn't guarding anymore. It was watching in the way one watches their own land, not with suspicion, but with stewardship. Inside, the photo from Karen's bin remained in a drawer, not because Rachel wanted to keep it, but because discarding it felt like erasing something she still didn't fully understand. There had been a story behind that storage, a truth buried under layers of performance and manipulation, and while Rachel didn't excuse it, she didn't need to know every detail. She only needed to ensure it would never be repeated. She didn't see herself as a victor. There had been no parade, no dramatic confrontation, no final line that settled everything with cinematic closure. What she had done was much harder. She had taken ownership, not just of the house, but of the narrative, of the silence others used to bend rules, and of the systems people used to disguise private intentions as communal tradition. The garage was quiet now, just a garage, but for Rachel, it had become something else entirely, a symbol of the line between memory and intrusion, generosity and exploitation, and the cost of maintaining your ground when no one else will help hold it for you. The house no longer whispered with questions. It stood whole, claimed, intact, and Rachel at last could breathe like it belonged to her, because it did. It always had.